you making the transition from beginner plants into more intermediate plants? If you checked that first video and you want to know part 2, stick around and let's dive into it. Hi, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see something behind me, it's tropical houseplants. So today is going to be a continuation of a previous video that I did, which is looking at potential plants for intermediate users to kind of transition onto. Nail down your beginner and your kind of more basic, easy care plants, and you want to level up. These are some suggestions that I would have in terms of maybe what you might want to consider. As I've mentioned, there is a first video, so I'll link it somewhere at the top. And you can see some of my original suggestions there, but a lot of you actually said, can we have a part 2 with a few more different plant types? And I do have a massive selection down below. You can't see it just yet. And I want to talk you through some of them, why I've decided to suggest some of these, and maybe some of the things you need to be looking out for. Not everything is going to be straightforward. There are going to be some intricacies, but shall we dive into the first plant? So a lot of people suggested having a look at some begonias. And begonias are a good plant to kind of work your way towards. So I've got an example here. I'll bring it in so you might be able to see. And you might be able to see this begonia specifically is called the Begonia seismorii. I think there is another scientific term for this, and again I'll add it somewhere at the top. And this is just propagation. This one I have got growing in semi-hydro, mainly because I wanted to see if I could grow begonia in semi-hydro, and actually this does bring in a good example, and hopefully this might pick up on screen. I don't know whether or not it will. If not, I will see if I can add it in editing. But essentially, what this is the reason I wanted to try this actually is because I wanted to see if it could withstand being in semi-hydro, because the roots of begonias, most begonias, are quite thin. They're very hair-like structures. Think of it similar to what you might get with a lot of ferns. So with this begonia, it seemed to work. However, I will quickly hasten to add that the Begonia seismorii, for the people that have been here for a while, this is one of many Chewbacca's progeny, basically. But the Begonia seismorii is, of the rhizomatous begonias, one of the hardiest. And actually that is something you need to be in mind and just be aware of when you're going to be starting off down the route of begonias is, are you looking at a rhizomatous begonia or are you looking at a cane begonia? Cane begonias tend to be a bit more upright. Think of your kind of standard begonia maculata whitei or the kind of polka dot begonia. Those tend to be a bit more upright, and it's usually quite easy to tell them apart because a lot of the rhizomatous begonias, they'll get wide and they'll stay relatively low in height, but a lot of the cane begonias will grow upwards. Now, if you've not ever experimented with any begonias, I would say start off with some cane begonias. Cane begonias, at least in my experience and from what I've seen from a lot of other people, they tend to be a lot more forgiving. Yes, they can become a bit cumbersome, but also it's one of the few begonias that you can see massive plants. If anybody's been following the bearded plantaholic, so Johnny on Instagram or even TikTok, you would have seen he's got a begonia maculata whitei, the polka dot begonia, but his is absolutely huge. It's probably taller than both me and him, basically. So you can get quite impressive begonias when they're of the cane variety, as long as you put in the time and the effort. The rhizomatous begonias, generally speaking, will stay a lot more compact. So again, if you're strapped for space, graduate to rhizomatous begonias. As I said, start with the cane begonias. They're a lot more forgiving when it comes to the kind of watering needs. And this is obviously one of the example plants that I was talking about, that it's not always as straightforward. Yes, I would suggest at least attempting some begonias if you're kind of at that intermediate stage in your collections, but do it gradually. So start with the cane, then move over to the rhizomatous, purely because the rhizomatous tend to be a bit more huffy and a bit more fussy, I found. And this is why I was saying, this is why I tried this specific rhizomatous begonia in semi-hydro, because for a rhizomatous begonia, this one tends to be more forgiving. So it's all kind of swings and roundabouts. You can look at things like the Begonia amphioxus, and interestingly, I was going to say that's not an easy cane begonia, because that is also a cane begonia. But actually, after it throws a bit of a wobbly, if you have it in kind of regular household humidity, and it looks like it's about to die, it will usually come back. It's a lot more resilient. You also get to attempt to do things with rhizomatous or even cane begonias that you can't do with a lot of the other houseplants. By that, I mean interesting ways of propagating. Because a rhizomatous begonia or even a cane begonia, you can propagate via division. So if you've got multiple places where it's growing, you can separate it and then you've got an entirely new plant. You can do a traditional kind of stem cutting like we might do with other plants, and pop that into whatever growing media you want to attempt to propagate in. And I've actually even attempted begonias, both types, in water, and they've actually done really well in that as well. Damp sphagnum moss worked. Perlite has also worked. Semi-hydro mix, a pon or a semi-hydro mix that you might choose, that also worked. And the same thing goes directly into soil, basically. And with these begonias, as I said, you can do divisions, you can do a stem cutting, you can also do a petiole cutting, which you can't do with a lot of other plants because it won't grow roots off the petiole. This one will. And you can also chop off the leaf and cut off different sections of the leaf. And as long as it's got veins that are going through it, and if I show you the back, you might be able to see some of the veins. There you go. There as well, and you can stick literally that section of leaf into whatever growing media you want to propagate in, maybe not water, although I think it's kind of worked a couple of times with water, but probably the more kind of solid forms of propagation media, and eventually it will root out. And there's a reason why I gave you the list in that order. So division is the fastest and the easiest, obviously, and the leaf tends to take the longest time, at least it has that in my experience, and it can fail on occasion as well. So bear that in mind, but it's a good way of being able to propagate in different ways. And as somebody, I think quite a few somebodies actually mentioned on a previous video, you can also do something very similar with quite a few peperonias. So that's a good thing. I'm not going to mention peperonias because I have made my views known on peperonias. And in hindsight, and this might trigger quite a few people, but again, remember, this is my opinion based on my experiences. If I could do one thing over again, I wouldn't have fallen down the rabbit hole of begonias. It would have saved me a lot of grief, time, and effort, basically, because it just wasn't for me. Not to say that it's not for other people, it just wasn't for me. But yes, begonias are a good transitional plant to move over to. And with a lot of the begonias, you'll get interesting texture on leaves, interesting coloration. So the world is your oyster. Next on the list is a genus of plants that is very near and dear to my heart, basically. And it's because I've been growing these for years. I've only got a few left in my collection, but I will show you them. I'll show you one of them now, basically. So I want to talk about alocasias. This is the dragon scale alocasia, granted a very kind of busted looking tiny one because this is a propagation of corn that I had, but it's a nice easy one that I can pick up and show you rather than some of the large ones that I thought that I should be able to add some pictures here, and you can see quite the size of them. Those are not easy to move around, basically. But alocasias, the reason why I want them to be on kind of the intermediate side of things, and I'll show you another one here, and this is the Alocasia Jacqueline, I think. I'm pretty sure there's a scientific name on this, although this has been hotly debated for a long time. This one I am growing in soil, and this one I am growing in leca. And if I show you the roots there, hopefully it might focus. There you go. You can see the roots there. Alocasias are one of those plants that really do love growing in semi-hydro, I found at least. Specifically because I've tried them with semi-hydro mix and pon and even regular semi-hydro mix. They do okay. I find what people have been growing them for a long time now, which is in leca, tends to do really well for them as well. I am going to go out on a limb and say that I have had better success with all of my alocasias, regardless of whether or not, so this is an example of a dual alocasia. The examples of the larger ones that I've got here are more traditional alocasias. They're not dual alocasias. They can get huge. These, both types, the kind of dual type and this more standard form of alocasia, I have had better success in soil every time, hands down. However, the soil route is, and actually even the semi-hydro route, that's why I wanted to kind of include it into the kind of intermediate section. And this is interesting because a lot of the times, a lot of alocasias, I'm thinking about the Alocasia amazonica or the Alocasia poly, sometimes known as, they are usually peddled off as beginner plants. I do not agree with that kind of route for things. And I've actually got propagation of that. Let me just pick it up and show you. The Alocasia poly, and you can see it's kind of slightly bleached out because it's under a very strong light. And I don't know whether or not the camera is going to pick it up. Hopefully it will if I'll get it to focus. You might be able to see, I don't know if you can see some of the spider webbing that is happening right there. In the middle there is some spider webbing. If not, I'll see if I can add a picture basically. And the issue on the poly is one of the reasons why I'm adding the alocasias generally as a non-beginner plant, but more of an intermediate plant. Because you will learn how to deal with spider mites. With an alocasia, hands down, guaranteed. Some of them I found more resistant, so this one specifically is more resistant to spider mites, but your more traditional thinner leaf alocasias will be highly susceptible to spider mites. So you just need to keep a beady eye, and it will teach you how to treat spider mites as an issue and all of the above. I have done a very in-depth video on how I care for my alocasia and the success that I've had, and I will again add it somewhere at the top so you can click there if you wanted to see a bit more details. But the thing that most people aren't aware of is that a lot of the alocasias and colocasias, and there is a difference on how the leaves kind of present themselves, they tend to grow natively close to waterways. What that means is they are one of those, and again, reasons why I've got it in an intermediate selection is because they are one of those plants that want to have water available to them at all times, but they also don't want to be waterlogged. That's always a nice mix to kind of balance out. The other issue as well with a lot of alocasias, and this isn't a great example because this isn't happening to this one. As I said, this is just a like one corm, and it's kind of taken this while to kind of get adjusted. But what you might get a lot of times with alocasias is you're part of the 2-leaf club or the 3-leaf club, and however many new leaves you get a new leaf and you lose an old leaf. And the reason for that is, especially if you're growing in soil, is that at a stage where an alocasia is pushing out a new leaf, it becomes even thirstier. And unless you're really monitoring it and being aware of kind of the moisture level in your soil, you might not pick it up. So you'd be like, well, I've always watered it 7 days a week. But what might happen 7 days a week? Every 7 days, so once a week, basically. That's the word. Word's hard for something. But the thing that you're going to need to remember with that one is that, okay, fine, when it wasn't actively bringing out a leaf, you were watering it once a week. What might happen, again, this is going to be dependent on your conditions in your care and your specific plant, as long as you're monitoring it, sometimes, and I'll give you an extreme example with mine, one of my bigger alocasias was getting watered once every 5 days or once every 6 days, I think, on average. When it was actively bringing in new leaves, it almost got to the point where it was getting watered every day in order for me to keep the old leaves and the new leaves. Does that make sense? Because what happened a lot of the times, and this is a thing, again, a reason why I'm putting it in the intermediate section, it's a bit more of a kind of process that you need to get used to, is if the alocasia is running low on water, what it will do, and this is what a lot of plants do, not just alocasias, it will sacrifice one of its oldest leaf or its oldest leaf in order to make sure that the newest leaf comes through. So the way that you get around that is by monitoring your soil a lot more. And I say intermediate and not advanced with this one because after you've done this a few times with some of your alocasias in your space, you'll kind of get the hang of it, and it won't be so much of a conscious process anymore. It'll be a lot more of a, okay, I need to just be doing this, and you kind of instantly slot into that mind frame for that specific plant. But for that reason alone, I think this is definitely more of an intermediate plant. It's unfortunate, even with the polys, and I know that there's going to be people out there that are going to go, oh no, but I was a beginner when I started with these plants and I've never had an issue. That's fine. But as by a whole, it tends to be slightly different, and it tends to be one of those things that a lot of people would probably agree with me a few years down the line, saying, yeah, if I started alocasias or even begonias a bit later on in my collecting journey, I probably would have had better success with them. And that's the thing as well with a lot of these plants that might be, at least in my opinion, more of an intermediate plant, but are sold and promoted to everybody as beginner plants. You tend to be put off with them really early on. So you'll be like, I've got a begonia, I don't know what I'm doing, I've killed it. Or I've got an alocasia, I don't know what I'm doing, it's supposed to be easy, I've got it, I've killed it. Years later, when you have multiple plants and you're very adept at growing, you almost have that mind block of kind of going, I won't try that again, it was too difficult, I failed. You failed because you were doing it at the wrong part of your journey, if that makes sense. If you knew a bit more like what you do now and you only tried it now, you would probably have much better success. But it's unfortunate because that kind of block happens quite early on in your journey. But yeah, definitely ones I would say give them a try. They can be very rewarding and an exceptional range of really interesting foliage and a lot of interesting variegated forms as well. One on the list is, and I've got a really bad example because I've never been particularly successful in growing these, and they don't excite me enough that I want to kind of keep trying. Personally, this is probably not going to be the case for everybody. This is not also one of the most interesting versions of these plants, and these plants that I'm talking about now are Aglaonemas, or I think also known as Chinese evergreens. Again, and you'll notice, I think pretty sure every single thing on this list is pushed as more of a beginner plant, basically. But yeah, I think it's also called Chinese evergreens. So you can get, so this more kind of, dare I say, boring form of it, basically. So these are the more green forms. There's a tiny bit of silvering that you can see on this. I don't even know which one this one is. If I do remember, I'll add it at the top. But they are usually sold as plants that thrive in low light. People who've been around on the internet long enough know that that is a crock of. But yeah, it's no plant will ever thrive in low light. It will just die slower for those plants, basically. But these ones do prefer to have slightly dimmer light conditions. Definitely, in my experience with a lot of the alocasias, some that I've experienced at least, it's not just this one, they really do not like that bright and direct light. They tend to be happiest, I think, in medium light, generally speaking. They are exceptionally slow plants, so that's why I'm saying it's probably not one for beginners. Beginners like that instant dopamine dopamine hit of something growing quite quickly. This isn't one. Most of the alocasias generally will not be fast-growing plants. They tend to be quite slow-growing. Also, with this type of plant, alocasia, and I am growing this in a semi-hydro mix, and this one's doing really well for me. I struggled a lot to kind of keep the moisture levels correct with this plant because it's one of those plants that likes to go towards dry but doesn't really like going fully dry, and it can rot out really quickly. And these are the type of plants, and this is why I don't have so many of them in my collection, where the smallest mistake in terms of watering, it's not forgiving. So you might end up losing half of the sleeves to rot, basically. And then you're just like, that took me months or even years because it's such a slow growing plant. It's so disheartening, basically. So, but there are really interesting forms of this, really colourful ones, or ones with a lot of white and hardly any green, or loads of reds and pinks and all these things. Those, in my experience, and based on what I'm hearing from a lot of other people, tend to be even harder than the green ones. So again, this is one that it's an intermediate plant at stages, I would say. So if you really want to get into Aglaonemas, start with the slightly more dull looking ones, the greener ones. See if you can get their care down right for a few months, and then transition over to the more colourful ones. trust me, you will thank me for the experience that you will learn from the green ones, and then just know that you're leveling up by going for the more colourful ones. And then you can keep them growing. They can get a bit scraggly, they can get a bit kind of etiolated, leaning towards a light, but predominantly a lot of times is because people have put them in some of their darkest corners thinking, yes, this is a plant that thrives in low light. But the other thing as well, and I think one of the really famous kind of rare Aglaonemas is the Aglaonema pictum tricolor, if I'm not mistaken. It's the one that looks like an army camouflage. And that's an interesting one because a lot of people were trying to get it for a long time. It was really expensive. People were just like, why is it so expensive? Knowing how slow these plants can grow, that's why they're so expensive. And they were also expensive, at least in my opinion, because the growers were trying to get them to a pretty enough way of being able to be sold. Because a lot of people, when they've grown them, out of a lot of the Aglaonemas, what you'll get is a very barren stem and then 3 leaves or 4 leaves at the top, and it looks very palm-like, rather than a more fuller plant. I don't know why, I've never had that plant. Do I think it's pretty? Yes. Will I ever pay the prices for it? No. Can I be bothered to kind of go there and do that with that plant? Probably no again. But I get why there is a lot of people that are fans of that plant, basically. But yeah, Aglaonemas, in my humblest of opinions, definitely not a beginner plant. Definitely one that you want to transition to as an intermediate plant. It will teach you patience. It will teach you proper watering techniques, and it will also teach you how to get light levels down correct. And the other little side note that I will add here is the more colourful ones, those pinky, reddy ones, and even the white ones, they need more light. But again, my experience with those, if you give them too much light, again, they also don't like it. So it can be, I don't know, understand why this is meant to be an easy plant. I don't, at least in my experience. Yours might vary and some other people's might vary. As I said, most of my videos, that still holds true. I've never found this to be an easy plant, ever. Any form of an Aglaonema. So that's what I'm saying. This might be one to try out at least. Right, the last 2 plant types that I want to talk about are almost closely related in terms of how people associate them in their brains. So the first one is going to be succulents, and spoiler, the second one that I'm going to be doing in the section entirely separate to this one is going to be cacti. So coming into kind of the more succulent side of things, hopefully that will focus, there we go. So that is an example of a succulent plant that I own. I will add names at the very top there. But, and this was actually gifted to me. I got some orchids. I got a large order of orchids, and the grower that I was buying the orchids from sent me this. I can't remember if there was a label on it as well. I had to really go and investigate. So if I get the name wrong and you know that this is something different, do let me know. But yeah, succulents might surprise a few people as to why I'm putting them on this list. And this would be more for the people that the hovering plant parents, basically, or the overwaterers out there. This can be a true challenge for you, both this and the cacti, in terms of really reeling back your watering. Almost true at the same level as Hoyas as well, but this one's even more so. And the reason why I'm saying this is a lot of people might say, you know what, don't water it until the leaves wrinkle up. But I've also found that sometimes it's a very fine line, especially for the forgetful people out there, especially for the underwaterers, where they'll be like, I'm going to leave it until it wrinkles, and they've left it to basically turn to dust, and they're just like, oh, I should have watered it at some point in its life. So two flips of the coin, basically. And this is the thing, a lot of people will buy things that are called succulent, and that's the other thing that we need to discuss. It's almost like describing a lot of the aroids that we might have as leafy plants. The word succulent could also apply to cacti. It's just because, oh, the leaves are succulent, so they're slightly kind of fatter and juicier, so to speak. But all of these plants are in different genuses. A lot of the succulents, they're different species as well, so they're not always necessarily that closely related to themselves. Granted, maybe if you go further back genetically, in terms of families and all of these things, you might see that there is going to be an overlap. I haven't gone into that much detail. I don't think I've ever been particularly into succulents or particularly into cacti. I've always had some in my collection or around my house, even growing up as well. but they're not something that ever fascinated me. And I think this might hold true for a lot of people from the warmer, drier countries of the world as well. Where I grew up was Greece and Cyprus. It can be very arid at times and very, very hot. So succulents and cacti are things that grow out in nature where I was kind of born and raised wild. Basically, they're almost like weeds a lot of the time. So they don't bring me as much excitement, basically. Interestingly, I think, if I'm not mistaken, cacti and succulents in some of the more kind of tropical parts of the world, in some of the countries in the Far East, are a big thing. So there's a lot more people there into these types of plants than there would be in what we consider the kind of tropical foliage plant. I would imagine for similar reasons, where something that's more kind of tropical in its sense in terms of where it would grow, it needs high humidity, it's got those leaves and all of these things. If you see it every day and that's what you were born in that region of the world and you see that all the time, it's not that exciting for you. Something like this that doesn't grow naturally where you live, however, probably would be considered exotic for you. So swings and balances basically. But yeah, this is going to be one that you're going to need to get the watering right. And cacti is slightly different. I'll talk about them in just a moment. So making sure that you're not overwatering them in winter, making sure that they're getting the right amount of light. I mean, realistically, a lot of these plants, if you think about where they are growing, a lot of the times, some of them might need slightly shadier conditions. Some plants like the lithops and I think some of the haworthias, they've also got some thicker roots that will actually pull them down into the soil or sand potentially where they're growing in order to kind of cover some of the plant up because the light is so bright. So a lot of these plants will do best in the brightest window that you have if you're growing them indoors. Now the flip side of that is you're sitting there going, oh, these need a lot of light, and some people might move them out into their garden. Change your mindset then and give them some shade, because these plants, regardless of how they might be growing in nature, we do not have kind of, well, hopefully we don't have poached plants. So these have been grown in certain conditions for a certain period of time. They have got used to lower light levels. What you can do, it won't necessarily kill most succulents, but it will stress them out. And sometimes you might get reddening or blushing on the actual foliage, for lack of better words. And that is anthocyanins, which are chemicals that are released in order for the plant to kind of bathe in its own kind of sunblock, really. So in order to not get damaged by the light levels. Again, some of these succulents are very interesting. Again, reason why I'm putting them onto the intermediate stage of things, because some of them will have clear windows. And the reason why you get those clear windows is because when they get those bright lights, in order for them not to fry, it would mean that the light would get funneled in through that window. It will bounce around in the green section inside of that, kind of think of it as a bit of a cup sometimes, and not damage the plant so much because it can kind of diffuse the light. But they can be quite rewarding as well. And I don't know whether or not you might be able to see if I kind of focus in on that. You might be able to see in the middle of each one of those leaflets, you might see something poking out. Those are spent blooms. So every single one of these kind of leaves will get a single flower coming through it. And this actually gave me an amazing show at the end of the summer as well. So swings roundabouts, but getting the light level of this can be crucial, and getting the watering down is also crucial. And that's why I don't really think that for most beginners, these are the best things, especially because a lot of the times you see decorative succulents being sold and people just add them in offices where they're hiding out. This is, I killed it, I am not good at dealing with plants. No, you just didn't give it the right conditions, basically. So that's why I'm thinking potentially for the more intermediate kind of plant parent, this might be a good option, or any kind of succulent generally. So into the last category that I want to talk about, which is cacti. And I'm pretty sure what I've got here is not a true cactus. This is a euphorbia, if I'm not mistaken. And I think it's a euphorbia trigona, and I will add it at the top there. And you will get kind of multiple branching that you might get on this cactus. Some of the more traditional cactuses that people might be aware of, I can't remember now if it's not called postman. Cacti, these are very kind of, they grow natively at certain parts of America and South America, and I'm thinking about the ones that are quite columnar, and they'll get like an arm on one side and maybe an arm on another side. Those tend to take years to do that. So if you're finding mature forms of that plant with branching out, that question if it has been fully grown in kind of activity, but kind of grown by growers rather than being coached by nature, because some of those plants take years, if not decades, to get to the level of maturity that they would need in order to branch out. I think they might also be protected in many parts of their natural habitats, so be very aware of that. But cacti are an interesting thing, and people again might be questioning about why are you putting it in an intermediate? Yes, theoretically, some cacti, if you know what you're going into from day one, you probably could grow this as a beginner. And a lot of people, when they're starting off as kids, grow these really successfully. And I think the reason for that is a lot of the times kids, if you've ever been around small humans for long enough, you'll realize that their attention doesn't tend to stay on one thing for too long. So actually, a lot of the times with things like cacti, the reason why they do really well with the children is because the kid will get distracted by something shiny in the corner and forget about that plant until weeks later, and then it will eventually water it. And for most cactuses, that suits them fine because they are from parts of the world, and that's the reason why I'm showing you this plant specifically. Instead, I don't have a more traditional cactus, is because I don't have any in my collection, is because those plants are kind of used to growing like that in nature. So if you think about deserts, where you kind of relate a lot of the times for a lot of cactuses are very dry, arid places. One thing that most people don't realize is that most of those parts of the world, it can be very dry and very, very hot during the day. But at night time, a lot of the times the temperature will have a significant drop, and that's when you will get potentially some condensation happening, or maybe even some rain happening, and that's when these plants are used to getting their moisture. Basically, the same thing goes as to why I think is it CAMS, crassulaceous acid metabolism. It might be wrong with that one, and I'll see if I can add the correct name at the top there. These types of plants generally are the plants that will transpire at night because they will open up their stomatas at night time when the temperatures are lower. Otherwise, if they do it during the day, there's more of a chance that more of the moisture that's within them will evaporate. So they are adapted in that way to do it at night time. The thing with cactuses that can be quite a good thing, especially if you've got a large collection, is they tend to be low maintenance for the intermediate grower as well, because what you will do, again, you need to get the watering level just right. In my opinion, with a cactus, if you think it needs watering, wait another week and then water it at least, or wait another week or two and then water it basically. The other thing that a lot of people forget about cactuses, true cactuses, not necessarily euphorbias, because this I've just watered today and it's doing fine. This one needs watering even in the winter because I've got it in a very bright windowsill above a radiator. So that's another thing that you need to remember, is with a lot of true cactuses, you pretty much stop watering them kind of autumn time and you pick up again kind of mid-spring, basically. And you don't have to worry about them. They're done. They are kind of more or less in their dormant state at that point. They really do not need water. They really do not absorb water fast enough. And especially if you are buying a very large established cactus, do not try to mess around with watering, thinking, oh, I need to water maybe a bit more. Err on the side of heavily underwatering. And again, this section is more intermediate because I'm thinking of people who might be overwaterers. This will really teach you some control because there's not many other plants that we can kind of not water for the entirety of pretty much autumn and winter and then have them survive for the spring. Cactuses are the ones that will be more than happy to do this. Obviously, keep an eye out and see if it's kind of wrinkling and puckering up too much. And even then, some of them prefer it that way before you water it heavily, basically. So that is something to remember. The other type, I'm not sure if this is a type of cactus specifically, but this is one that a lot of beginners will get on, and I'm being very, very careful. And this was a plant trade. This is a variegated, and I'm trying really hard not to touch it as well. This is a variegated opuntia. So, and I'm going to put that down because I don't want to be touching it. I'll probably bring it up again in just a moment. But the opuntias, kind of think of the bunny ear cacti, and a lot of these ones will be the ones that will generate fruit, the prickly pears. They have got, I think they're called glaucids. As I said, I'm not an expert in cactus and succulents, but from what I was kind of looking around, so glaucids are, and let me see, bringing it up again, it's going to end up inevitably touching me, which is why I don't want to happen. I don't know if you can see those clusters of thorns that you can see on there. This one's not particularly bad. Some of the puntias that are very, very fuzzy kind of selections of thorns, those are, I hesitate with the word dangerous, but they will eck you up like you cannot believe. If you touch them, they will go in multiple directions. You're going to take hours to get all of those thorns out of you. I cannot remember the lady who's, I always call her the cactus and succulent lady on TikTok. I'll see if I can add her name. Love her to bits, basically. But she was kind of sharing some stories, and credit to her for these stories, but I think somebody was saying they bought these types of plants, they put it in a commercial greenhouse or something like that, but they had the fans going on, those glaucids kind of released from those thorns, essentially very, very fine hair-like thorns, released from the plants, they got into the air system, and people were going into hospital because they breathed in all these very, very fine, irritating uh, thorny hairs, basically. So the people from warmer countries that have got prickly pears growing more naturally around them, every time we see people that have brought them into their house, we all just go, why? 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 And I come from a country where we eat prickly pears, the fruit of these plants, all the time, and it is several layers of gloves that your mothers, aunts, sisters, fathers, whoever is kind of peeling these fruits for young kids a lot of the times is wearing in order to get these things peeled, because they bite back and they can be, and even with all those layers of gloves, it can still get through. Just very, very with volunteers specifically, I would almost go on a limb and say, if you don't need to have it in your house, do not have it in your house. It's way too risky, especially if you've got small animals or even small humans. So just bear that in mind. But yeah, I think that was all of different plant types that I wanted to cover for the kind of intermediate people out there, or people who are going to key in a more intermediate state of their collection. I'd be curious, do you agree with me on some of these? Do you disagree with me? I'd love to have that conversation with you in the comments down below. Some people might be going, yes, I had this when I was a beginner and it was fine. Other people are like, no, absolutely not, definitely agree that it needs to be an intermediate or even an advanced plant. Let us all know. I am sure there will be a heavy debate down below because, as I said, a lot of these plants, I think nearly all of these plants, are a lot of the times pushed as beginner plants, where realistically they're more of an intermediate plant, in my humblest of opinions, basically. But yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I will see you here soon, and I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.